Great. I'd like to welcome up a talk, Early Curators, Building Connections, Confidence and Care through cross.
We've changed the title.
Yeah. Oh.
A good title.
Okay. Lucy Maycock and Jo Hatton from Horniman Museum and Gardens.
Yeah, we decided that was a bit too much, so we've simplified it now. So yeah, as was just said, thank you so much for the invitation to speak at this year's conference and for all the excellent papers we've heard already, and hopefully what we'll be talking about today will make some connections as well with some of the things people were talking about yesterday. So this. So yeah, so we're presenting this together. So just a little bit of background, first of all. So Lucy and I are going to speak about just one element of a much larger National Heritage lottery funded project that's really coming to the final stages. Over the last 5-6 years, we've been working on this at the Horniman Museum and Gardens in South East London. And we'll be sharing some of our experience and learnings from one element of the project, which we called Early Curators. So just a quick summary of Nature Love. So it includes, I'm going to use the pointer. So it includes, so it includes a full redisplay of the Historical Natural History Gallery, which includes our infamous walrus, of course. The building of a new cafe and children's play area in the gardens, and a community garden, which we have a picture of sadly at the moment, and new glass houses.
Turn to look behind you.
Okay, keep facing forward. Yeah, so that's those. And the gardening element of it is all based around promoting sustainable gardening practices and also health and well-being. So the main aims of the project really are to explore human relationships, understanding and connections with nature, including reflections on our colonial legacies, diversifying our audiences, getting more people involved, and making the museum more representative of local communities and their needs, which has been a really important and main focus in many ways as well. And empowering and encouraging audiences to take action for nature and build a more sustainable future that we all share, including humans and non-humans, and linking this to the climate and ecological emergency work that's been going on at Horniman for quite some time now. And this is kind of, turning away again. And this is kind of how we've been doing it. So this is some elements of the project here. So we've been co-producing a lot of different activities in the space. One is what we've called, it was called Action Zone, it's now called Discovery Den, which we co-curated with primarily under fives audience and for under fives audience based around local nature and engaging with that. We've got Living with Nature, which is co-produced with our Curator of Social Practice, fantastic project, who's been working with researchers from Caribbean and Tibetan diaspora communities to deliver that. External voice labels in the gallery are all over the place. We've got a disabled artist response space as well. And then we've got schools projects.
Yes. Thank you very much. So the Horniman has a really long history of co-producing exhibitions and spaces with community groups. But unfortunately, this is something that hadn't typically been offered to our formal learning partners or to schools. I think we see that quite a lot across museums, actually. Despite this, school groups form 30% of the Horniman's visitors in term time. They have a dwell time that is 2 hours longer than our average visitor. And school visits are a really big driver for future visits to the museum. So we know about 20% of our general visitors have been to the museum on a school trip and say that it was one of the things that informed their visit to the museum. So a really, really significant audience for us. The Natural History Gallery was particularly popular with school groups and younger audiences. And so Nature and Love presented a really invaluable opportunity to make and dedicate permanent space on gallery for this key audience. So celebrating and showing their position as really, really key stakeholders in our organisation. But also while we were doing that, opening up behind the scenes work and roles in our museum, showing the processes behind making a new gallery. And while we were doing that, building investment in our museum and also thinking about future museum professionals from our local community. So there were 6 theme areas planned for the new gallery. There still are, there will be 6 theme areas. And we identified projects with formal learners that would sit across each theme area to make sure they're represented across the entire gallery. The first project is called Positive Action for Nature, which is a really major co-production or co-curation project with a secondary school that I'm happy to chat about separately. We won't be talking about that today. And then Early Curators sits across the remaining 5 sections of the gallery. And essentially, Early Curators is a label creation project, but it's more really about the process than the output. Yes. So we identified 5 partners for each of these areas, drawing on our priority audiences for formal learning. So 2 mainstream primary schools were selected as partners, both of whom have very high levels of pupils who receive Pupil Premium Grant. Similarly, we have a holiday clubs provision where we work with local primary schools, again, where their children are living in poverty or perhaps need wellbeing interventions in the school holidays. We work with them too through Holy Trinity Primary School. We also work with the specialist school, Drumbeat, and then we brought together a group of home educating families, mainly from our home education network and advisory panel. It was really, really important for us that we were building on relationships that we already had rather than trying to restart new ones. That was a bit of a theme of talks yesterday, and using this as a way to really kind of expand those relationships, but also to learn more about local need. So each of these groups worked with us for up to a year. And during that process, they selected and then creatively responded to a specimen that will then go on display in our gallery, producing a label, a really bright, colourful, beautiful label to sit alongside their selected specimen. The project followed a skeleton structure across all 5 partners, but with significant changes and adaptations to fit the different aims and needs of each partner. So firstly, setting the context. So learners visited our museum, but as I've said, a lot of these were local kids. They knew the museum. Loads of kids come to the Horniman like every year on a school trip and they're sick to death of us. So really this was about finding out what was going on behind the scenes. They met a curator. There they are with Jo doing her thing. But we also introduced key terms to them like taxidermy, specimen, curator, labels, to give them a bit of understanding for what they were doing. And actually these terms became measures of change and for evaluation across the project, along with emotional responses to our galleries and our spaces as they kept coming back across the year. Learners also learned about wet specimens, skeletal taxidermy specimens, what they were, what those different things are, how they're made, using our handling collection of about 2,500 objects. We have a big handling collection. They also went to our gallery specifically to look at labels with guidance and things to scaffold that. And they also visited the freshly decanted Natural History Gallery. Can't see the name of it yet. The Natural History Gallery. So they could see kind of where their final label would be going. Next, specimen selection. So each group of mainstream learners were given roles of researchers, presenters, and field workers. And those roles were assigned by their adults based on confidence or areas that they knew kids would particularly thrive in or where they could develop well. Each group was given 3 to 4 specimens from their theme area, and Jo worked really carefully to select specimens that were all around a set area in the layout, so the label could be in a fixed place, and it meant that the project could happen slightly later and not be affected by the timelines of design for the gallery. The researchers researched those specimens, and then the presenters presented them to the whole school, who then would vote on which one they wanted to be the final intervention for their school. Meanwhile, learners nominated as field workers visited our collections centre, and they were the first children to visit the site since its days as a Victorian school. So this was a really, really big deal for us. Learners got to see and photograph their chosen specimens with our lovely photographer, Pat. They also learned about packing, they made pillows, they learned about pest management with our collections and conservations teams, and they even put their teacher or adults in the freezer which was a particularly fantastic moment. Home educated families and specialist school learners work through the same stage, but more organically and together. So next, putting the A in STEAM, that's what we're all about, making the artwork for the label. So each school pre-chose the art form that they wanted to respond to their specimen with, and it was generally based on wider school priorities or selecting materials that the school couldn't afford to have themselves. The home ed families had a pre-selected art form to simplify that process a bit of bringing people together. Learners then worked together to create artwork at the school, be it clay stoats or printed turtles, collage turtles, and they had a lot of fun and joy sharing their learnings about those animals at the same time, and also showing us around their school. So it was a really lovely kind of reciprocal, you've been to us and now we're coming to see you guys. And then lastly, and most importantly, the celebration with prize giving, certificates, notebooks, all printed with their final designs that they got to take away. And they also collaboratively developed the accompanying label text on this final day that they had with us. And again, it was so full of joy, and it really, really captured so beautifully how comfortable these kids now were in our museum spaces with staff, and with all these check-in routines that we put in place that were now just really familiar to them. Thank you very much. So here are the final designs and the final artworks, and you can see a mock-up of what the labels will look like just over there on the left-hand side. And since the project was delivered over the last year, we've continued to keep in touch with all of these different groups, with behind-the-scenes visits to the gallery as it's in progress, testing out the AV, and all the while learning more skills about building design museums. Very, very briefly, just how much did it cost, which is always the question that you ask. I think it's really important to say that we delivered this whole project using core staff time. So there was no additional staff time. It was done around teaching and curating and gallery making. And actually the majority of our expenses were on those artists and also on having really lovely high quality resources that we then left with the schools at the end of the project as well. So what worked? And Joe's going to say a little bit about this.
Okay, so in no particular order, we've got, oh, it's come up nicely, that slide now.
Yes.
Okay, so design and development, specimen selection and interpretation approach. As Lucy said, we collected a quote from each of the schools with what they wanted to say, and it was broadly based around environmental engagement in the main, wasn't it? So in the context of the display, that wasn't always the message. In the case, you know, these two, one was about historical pet trade and one was about lifespans and life histories. So we had a little bit of discussion about how to make that accessible, not just to the school, but also to more general audience, they would make sense of that. And we incorporated an additional line in there, kind of tying it in some way. Any additions in that one? And then, of course, museum practices, processes, language, pitch, and workflows were quite interesting. I've actually got one around language. I think I started to use the term practice, which I'd never done before. Artistic practice, what's your practice? I just used to say work, you know, just in my work. And Lucy's team also found that some of the exhibition and design speak was not necessarily something that they work with on an everyday basis, like our exhibition design manager talking about like assets and things, for example. It's like, well, that's just photographs, isn't it? Yeah, that kind of thing. Behind the scenes collections tours as well, dispelling some of the more elements behind the scenes, thinking about who's involved in making a new gallery, health and safety, PP, all of those kinds of things. And then probably one of the most important things we learned from the project was this idea of upskilling and professional development across all the different teams, from the curatorial team, sub-learning team, the collections management team. It was just really beneficial for some of the collections teams to work with other audiences, because obviously they were doing a lot of behind the scenes work like packing, moving, decanting objects, and one of our trainees actually got a role, we gave her a taste, and then she got a role in a community engagement setting and organisation afterwards. Do you want to embellish that?
No, don't think so. Okay. Should we do?
Yeah.
Yeah. So last of all, very aware of time. Was it worth it? So yes, it was absolutely worth it. Please do projects like this at your museums if you're not already. The impact was just incredible. Evaluation was embedded right the way across the project. So every session had pre and post evaluation. Everything was changed, learning from what had happened in the previous session. And because we have 5 iterations of early curators, we were able to apply learnings to the next group as we went on. We're just going to finish with some really lovely quotes from teachers who were interviewed and paid for their time at the end of the project. Unfortunately, we didn't put them on a slide, but I'm just going to read a couple out. So one teacher said, "I have a couple of children whose confidence isn't very high. At the beginning, they were quite shy, not sure whether or not to get involved. And then when it came to the end of the process, it was like they were a completely different child." Another one that says, "This project could be used to help other museums to understand the needs of our children and how to adapt to them. It's actually not that hard. I think museums and galleries sometimes try to tick a box for kids with SEND, but they don't actually meet the needs of our kids." And then the very, very last one is that, if I can find it, the Horniman really invested in doing their best to capture the voice of Lewisham students, and in particular our school. They really treasured what we had to say and worked hard to find ways of capturing student thoughts and their voice. The students love being part of the project, and knowing that the Horniman is delivering environmental messaging to our students is reassuring and essential. And we're so excited now the gallery will be opening next year to continue these links with these learners, to show them and give them the opportunity to show off their work to their friends and their families and other people too. So that's Early Curators. Yeah.
I do have a copy of the evaluation report if anybody wants to take a look. It's not a very long one, but if you wanted to read more, then I have that. Any questions?
We're a bit short on time, but there is one question online. So if any of you in the room have questions, if we can do that during the break. So the question we have is, how successful have you been engaging secondary schools? Do you have any tips for engaging them with museum work?
Yes, I jumped straight in then because this is something we're really proud of. So we won Learning and Engagement Programme of the Year 2 years ago for our work with secondary schools. And we've increased engagement with secondary schools by 60% on pre-COVID figures, mainly through careers programmes, through really careful partnership working. So we've identified 3 local secondary schools that now work with us regularly, and also through a triangle model that we've developed with universities local to us, particularly Goldsmiths, where students at the university are trained in facilitation, particularly artists and science students. And then they will deliver for secondary school students. So those learners are getting to learn from local people, young people who might be in a position that they could be in a few years. And then we also help to kind of scaffold and facilitate all of that. So we're engaging, but in a way that's going to be really beneficial for the university and for the secondary school. And that's been particularly successful in growing our secondary audience and programme. Quick answer.